All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. I think this is going to end up being like episode 56, 57. We're currently reading Civil Disobedience by Henry Thoreau. Through the previous episode, we began it. All right, let's pick up where we left off at. All voting is a sort of gaming, like checkers or backgammon, with a slight moral tinge to it, a playing with right and wrong, with moral questions, and betting naturally accompanies it. The character of the voters is not staked. I cast my vote, perchance, as I think right, but I am not vitally concerned that right should prevail. I am willing to leave it to the majority. Its obligation, therefore, never exceeds that of expediency. Even voting for the right is doing nothing for it. It is only expressing to men feebly your desire that it should prevail. A wise man will not leave the right to the mercy of chance, nor wish it to prevail through the power of the majority. There is but little virtue in the action of masses of men. When the majority shall at length vote for the abolition of slavery, it will be because they are indifferent to slavery, or because there is but little slavery left to be abolished by their vote. They will then be the only slaves. Only his vote can hasten the abolition of slavery who asserts his own freedom by his vote. I hear of a convention to be held at Baltimore or elsewhere for the selection of a candidate for the presidency, made up chiefly of editors and men who are politicians by profession. But I think, what is it to any independent, intelligent, and respectable man what decision they may come to? Shall we not have the advantage of his wisdom and honesty, nevertheless? Can we not count upon some independent votes? Are there not many individuals in the country who do not attend conventions? But no, I find that the respectable man, so-called, has immediately drifted from his position, and despairs of his country, when his country has more reason to despair of him. He forthwith adopts one of the candidates thus selected as the only available one, thus proving that he is himself available for any purposes of the demagogue. His vote is of no more worth than that of any unprincipled foreigner or hireling native who may have been bought. Oh, for a man who is a man. Oh, for a man who is a man and, as my neighbor says, has a bone in his back which you cannot pass your hand through. Our statistics are at fault. The population has been returned too large. How many men are there to a square 1,000 miles in this country? Hardly one. Does not America offer any inducement for men to settle here? The American has dwindled into an odd fellow, one who may be known by the development of his Oregon gregariousness and a manifest lack of intellect and cheerful self-reliance, whose first and chief concern, on coming into the world, is to see that the almshouses are in good repair, and, before yet he has lawfully donned the virile garb, to collect a fund for the support of the widows and orphans that may be, who, in short, ventures to live only by the aid of the mutual insurance company, which has promised to bury him decently. It is not a man's duty, as a matter of course, to devote himself to the eradication of any, even the most enormous wrong. He may still properly have other concerns to engage him, but it is his duty, at least, to wash his hands of it, and, if he gives it no thought longer, not to give it practically his support. If I devote myself to other pursuits and contemplations, I must first see, at least, that I do not pursue them sitting upon another man's shoulders. I must get off him first, that he may pursue his contemplations too. See what gross inconsistency is tolerated. I have heard some of my townsmen say, quote, I should like to have them order me out to help put down an insurrection of the slaves, or to march to Mexico. See if I would go. End quote. And yet these very men have each, directly by their allegiance, and so indirectly, at least, by their money, furnished a substitute. The soldier is applauded who refuses to serve in an unjust war by those who do not refuse to sustain the unjust government which makes the war. Is applauded by those whose own act and authority he disregards and sets at naught, as if the state were penitent to that degree that it hired one to scourge it while it sinned, but not to that degree that it left off sinning for a moment. Thus, under the name of order and civil government, We are all made at last to pay homage to and support our own meanness. After the first blush of sin comes its indifference, and from immoral it becomes, as it were, unmoral, and not quite unnecessary to that life which we have made. And then I'll stop there and we'll reflect upon some of the things that was mentioned in this opening of this episode. I think the thing that stands out to me the most about this is the common hypocrisies that people have when it comes to not wanting to partake or be a part of an evil or an injustice that is happening. But in the same token, they are not willing to sacrifice, whether it be convenience or whether it be a lifestyle. They're not willing to sacrifice to help eradicate those things. And so we've seen here where people recently were dismayed by seeing George Floyd be murdered on video by a police officer, and were willing to do things like put Black Lives Matter signs in their yard or turn their profile picture on social media black for a day or a month or a couple months. But when it comes time to miss a day at work, or when it comes time to miss time with their children to march or to be involved in a protest, or when it comes time to risk being arrested, when it comes time to risk being convicted, in an effort to struggle against the police terrorism that led to the murder of George Floyd, when it becomes time for that type of self-sacrifice to be made, that is when you see people start to look for the exit sign. That is when you see people start to opt out. And a lot of times those things are the justification for those things are people saying that, I can't get arrested because I can't lose my job, or I can't come out to protest, or I can't come out to community meetings or whatever it is because I don't have the time for those things. And I think that one of the things that has stood out to me, a saying that stood out to me from Martin Luther King Jr. that really changed my ideology and my thought process on how much I was willing to sacrifice, is from the speech, I've been to the mountaintop. And the last speech he gave before he was assassinated, and Martin Luther King Jr. said that don't ask what will happen to you don't ask what will happen to you if you miss work to go out and support the sanitation workers that are on strike. Ask what will happen to the sanitation workers that are on strike if you don't go out there to support them. And I think that same question needed to be asked for the people in this time period who were willing to say that they wouldn't go out to put down a slave insurrection, or they wouldn't be willing to go out to fight in the Mexican War. The same question has to be asked for them when it comes to what are you doing to end slavery? What are you doing to end the war in Mexico? And instead of asking what will happen to you if you take part in trying to end slavery, the question should be what will happen to these slaves if you don't take part? Not what will happen to you if you try to take part in ending the war that's in Mexico, but what will happen to the indigenous people in Mexico if you don't take part in it? And I think that we can look around in 2021 at the circumstances that both Mexico are in, and people who are descendants of Mexico, and the situation that the descendants of those slaves are in, and you can see the answer to the question, what will happen to those people if people didn't take part in those things. Here, and I'll pass this to somebody else to comment.
In order for society to see progress, people need to stand up as revolutionaries and have the conviction to act justly regardless of whatever consequences may come. I think that's a point being made here. If we want to end America's war on color, what just actions are we going to take regardless of the consequences? That's how I'd relate it to our message here. We're finding our spot in the essay right now. The broadest and most prevalent error requires the most disinterested virtue to sustain it. The slight reproach to which the virtue of patriotism is commonly liable, the noble are more likely to incur. Those who, while they disapprove of the character and measures of a government, yield to it their allegiance and support, are undoubtedly its most conscientious supporters, and so frequently the most serious obstacles to reform. Some are petitioning the state to dissolve the Union, to disregard the requisitions of the President. Why do they not dissolve it themselves, the union between themselves and the state, and refuse to pay their quota into its treasury? Do they not stand in the same relation to the state that the state does to the union? And have not the same reasons prevented the state from resisting the union which have prevented them from resisting the state? How can a person be satisfied to entertain an opinion merely and enjoy it? Is there any enjoyment in it if their opinion is that they are aggrieved? If you are cheated out of a single dollar by your neighbor, you do not rest satisfied with knowing that you were cheated, or of saying that you were cheated, or even with petitioning him to pay you your due. But you take effectual steps at once to obtain the full amount, and see that you are never cheated again. Action from principle, the perception and the performance of right, changes things and relations. It is essentially revolutionary, and does not consist wholly with anything which was. It not only divides states and churches, it divides families, it divides the individual, separating the diabolical in them from the divine. Unjust laws exist. Shall we be content to obey them, or shall we endeavor to amend them, and obey them until we have succeeded, or shall we transgress them at once? People generally, under such a government as this, think that they ought to wait until they have persuaded the majority to alter them. They think that if they should resist, the remedy would be worse than the evil. But it is the fault of the government itself that the remedy is worse than the evil. It makes it worse. Why is it more apt to anticipate and provide for reform? Why does it not cherish its wise minority? Why does it cry and resist before it is hurt? Why does it not encourage the citizens to be on the alert to point out its faults and do better than it would have them? Why does it always crucify Christ and excommunicate Copernicus and Luther and pronounce Washington and Franklin rebels? One would think that a deliberate and practical denial of its authority was the only offense never contemplated by the government. Else why what has it assigned its definite, its suitable, and proportionate penalty? If a person who has no property refuses but wants to earn 9 shillings for the state, they are put in prison for a period unlimited by any law that I know, and determined only by the discretion of those who placed them there. And if they should steal 90 times 9 shillings from the state, they are soon permitted to go at large again. If the injustice is part of the necessary friction of the machine of government, let it go, let it go. Perchance it will wear smooth. Certainly the machine will wear out. If the injustice has a spring, or a pulley, or a rope, or a crank exclusively for itself, then perhaps you may consider whether the remedy will not be worse than the evil. But if it is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say break the law. Let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine. What I have to do is to see, at any rate, that I do not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn. As for adopting the ways which the state has provided for remedying the evil, I know not of such ways. They take too much time, and a person's life will be gone. I have other affairs to attend to. I came into this world not chiefly to make this a good place to live in, but to live in it, be it good or bad. A person has not everything to do, but something, and because they cannot do everything, it is not necessary that they should do something wrong. It is not my business to be petitioning the governor or the legislature any more than it is theirs to petition me. And if they should not hear my petition, what should I do then? But in this case, the state has provided no way. Its very constitution is the evil. This may seem to be harsh and stubborn and unconciliatory, but it is to treat with the utmost kindness and consideration the only spirit that can appreciate or deserve it. So is all change for the better, like birth and death, which convulse the body. I do not hesitate to say that those who call themselves abolitionists should at once effectually withdraw their support, both in person and property, from the government of Massachusetts, and not wait till they constitute a majority of one, before they suffer the right to prevail through them. I think that it is enough if they have God on their side without waiting for that other one. Moreover, any person more right than their neighbors constitutes a majority of one already. I meet this American government, or its representative, the state government, directly and face to face once a year, no more, in the person of its tax gatherer. This is the only mode in which a person situated as I am necessarily meets it. And it then says distinctly, "Recognize me," and the simplest, most effectual, and in the present posture of affairs, the indispensablest mode of treating with it on in this head, of expressing your little satisfaction with it and love for it, is to deny it to then. My civil neighbor, the tax gatherer, is the very person I have to deal with. For it is, after all, with people and not with parchment that I quarrel. And they have voluntarily chosen to be an agent of the government. And I think that speaks to the role individuals play in institutions. That individuals choose to play the role they play in society. They are honed throughout their life to hold certain values, but they make their choices. And agents of the government make a choice to serve in an institution that is implicitly coercive, and I for one at least believe that makes it necessarily unjust.
I think one of the other things that I want to point out that was touched on at the beginning of those passages is the cycle that often happens in history of people resisting the government, or people resisting the status quo that the government is upholding, and those people being ostracized, or those people being criminalized. And I think that is one of the things that far too often people who aren't students of history, they fall in the trap of being victims of the propaganda that comes from institutions or comes from the government when a person or people try to rise up against something that is happening. And so whether you go to ancient Roman times when people were trying to have a more free belief in, or I don't know if more free is the right word, but when people were having a religious belief that was different than what was the mainstream religious belief at the time, you've seen how the government was used to try to ostracize those people, to try to criminalize those people. You've seen if we can just go to early American history, colonial times history, when people began to want to rise up against the British monarchy. The British monarchy being the government in control at the time, the authority at the time. Those people were those people were ostracized. Those people became outcasts. Those people were considered to be treasonous. That extrapolates out to once America becomes its own country and has its independence, that people who were struggling against some of the evils of American society, those people like John Brown, people like Harriet Tubman, those people were ostracized, those people were criminalized, those people were stigmatized. And often what you find is that, and again, this is something that I spoke about on the previous episode, often what you find is that people who end up being on the right side of history in the future are painted as being on the wrong side of history in the moment or in the present. And so I think that, again, Thoreau touched on that a little bit earlier, and I think that that's just something that has to be emphasized again. When the Black Panthers were having some of the prevalence that they were having in their organizations in the late 60s and in the early 70s, those same tactics were used. The criminalization of the Black Panthers, calling the Black Panthers terrorists, ostracization of the Black Panthers. And these are all things that these are all forms of political warfare, political imprisonment. One of the things that saying that I've come to use regularly is that war is politics with bloodshed and politics is war without bloodshed. And a lot of the same tactics and a lot of the same things and a lot of the same propaganda that is used in wartime to try to get a certain country or a certain set of people to be on the side of a country or a set of people while a war is going on, those same type of things are used in politics. So the same way that Islamophobia and Middle Eastern hate was used to try to generate support for the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, that same type of the same type of concept using anti-black rhetoric or anti-black thought was used for the war on drugs, was used more currently in the 90s when it was time to try to pass the police bill. And so I just think that those are all things that it's important to keep in mind as we're going forward, and to understand that if you rely on the institutions and on the government to get your information and to educate you, it will have you thinking that people who are your enemies are your friends, and it will have you thinking people who are your friends are your enemies.
And I want to say something in regards to subverting the status quo. The status quo. Every person feels pressure to adhere to the status quo, but we as conscientious people become aware that the status quo is unjust, and as conscientious people, we have a duty to resist this injustice, regardless of the consequences.
All right, let's hop back into this. How shall he ever know well what he is and does as an officer of the government or as a man, until he is obliged to consider whether he shall treat me, his neighbor, for whom he has respect, as a neighbor and well-disposed man, or as a maniac and disturber of the peace, and see if he can get over this obstruction to this neighborliness without a ruder and more impetuous thought or speech corresponding with his action. I know this well, that if 1,000, if 100, if 10 men whom I can name, if 10 honest men only, if one honest man in this state of Massachusetts, ceasing to hold slaves, were actually to withdraw from his co-partnership and be locked up in the county jail therefore, it would be the abolition of slavery in America. For it matters not how small the beginning may seem to be. What is once well done is done forever. But we love better to talk about it, and that we say is our mission. Reform keeps many scores of newspapers in its service, but not one man. If my esteemed neighbor, the state's ambassador, who will devote his days to the settlement of the question of human rights in the city council chamber, instead of being threatened with the prisons of Carolina, were to sit down the prisoner of Massachusetts, that state which is so anxious to foist the sin of slavery upon her sister, though at present she can discover only an act of inhospitality to be the ground of a quarrel with her, the legislator would not wholly waive the subject the following winter. Under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison. The proper place today, the only place which Massachusetts has provided for her freer and less desponding spirits, is in her prisons, to be put out and locked out of the state by her own act, as they have already put themselves out by their principles. It is there that the fugitive slave and that the Mexican prisoner on parole and the Indian come to plead the wrongs of his race should find them. On that separate but more free and honorable ground, where the state places those who are not with her but against her, the only house in a slave state in which a free man can abide with honor. If any think that influence would be lost there, and their voices no longer afflict the ear of the state, that they would not be as an enemy within its walls, they do not know by how much truth is stronger than error, nor how much more eloquently and effectively he can combat injustice who has experienced a little in his own person. Cast your whole vote, not a strip of paper, merely, but your whole influence. A minority is powerless while it conforms to the majority. It is not even a minority then, but it is irresistible when it clogs by its whole weight. If the alternative is to keep all just men in prison or give up war and slavery, the state will not hesitate which to choose. If 1,000 men were not to pay their tax bills this year, that would not be a violent and bloody measure, as it would be to pay them and enable the state to commit violence and shed innocent blood. This is, in fact, the definition of a peaceable revolution, if any such is possible. If the tax gatherer or any other public officer asks me, as one has done, quote, "But what shall I do?" end quote, my answer is, quote, "If you really wish to do anything, resign your office," end quote. When the subject has refused allegiance and the officer has resigned his office, then the revolution is accomplished. But even suppose blood should flow. Is there not a sort of bloodshed when the conscience is wounded? Through this wound, a man's real manhood and immortality flow out, and he bleeds to an everlasting death. I see this blood flowing now. And then we'll use that as the last passage for this episode. I think that one of the things that I would point out from in the passage that we read there is the concept that it would be the most just thing to do in a country where slaves exist is to be imprisoned being imprisoned because of your adverse ideology to slavery, or let's see, coming this way. And I think the same thing is to be said when Thoreau answers back to someone asking him what they should do, what it is that they should do when he tells them to resign from their position. I think that a lot of times we have conversations with people when they talk about it being an issue of just a few bad apples in the institution of policing, or someone saying that they're just doing their job, and or that they're a good cop, or that there are some good cops. And I think that one of the responses for that has always been a good cop is a cop who quits, or if you're a good cop, you will quit. And I think that a lot of times that is a jarring response to people, but I think that it's an inadequate response. I think that we have to get into a place of not simply, as Thoreau sort of stated there, not simply just prognosticating about these things and having long thoughts and deep conversations about some of the issues that persist in our society. And we have to begin the steps to taking actions to struggle against those things. And it doesn't matter if that action that you take is an action that you take by yourself, or it's an action that you take with 10 people or with 50 people. anything that has ever happened that has been monumental in society or in civilization did not begin being monumental. It began being small. It began with one person, or it began with 5 people, or with 10 people. And again, I think that is where the importance of having an understanding of history comes into place, because when you have that understanding of history, you do understand that just by going on the record and struggling against something, that is the beginning of whatever you're struggling against ending. The beginning of the ending of slavery did not happen with the Emancipation Proclamation being signed, or with the secession of the southern states. The beginning of the ending of slavery started with the first African that jumped over the boat, as opposed to being brought into slavery. It started with the first African mother who threw her baby into the water to drown, as opposed to allowing them to become enslaved. It started with the first set of people that in Haiti, when Haiti revolted against the slave owners that were there. It began with every slave that ran away to try to escape that didn't successfully escape. It began with every slave that learned how to read illegally. And those are the beginnings of a revolution. The same thing in when you go and you look at the civil rights era. It didn't simply begin with the Montgomery bus boycott, or it didn't simply begin with Birmingham in '63 or Selma in '65. It began with the first black person that drank from a white water fountain, or the first black person who refused to get up out of their seat, who was arrested and whose name was never known. You know, these are all the pieces that begin revolutions. And so I think that when we begin to understand the power that we do have individually to be a part of pushing for collective transformation, again, that is the beginning of changing the circumstances that we exist in. I think that one of the other things that is important to point out there is, one of the other things I want to highlight is the hypocrisies that we have of individualism in this country or in this society, where you're told that, you know, your vote counts, your one vote matters. You're told that if you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything. You can be whatever you want to be. This idea of American exceptionalism. But a lot of times that same mentality is not converted over when it comes to going against mainstream society. So when that individualism can be used to benefit mainstream society, when it can be used to benefit capitalism, you are encouraged to highlight your individualistic expression, or to express yourself individually. But when it comes to struggling against injustice, when it comes to fighting against mainstream society, a lot of times that idea of being an individual or only being one person is used in the opposite way. And so I would say to anybody who believes that their vote matters, or that their vote counts, and that each vote counts, each vote matters, that same concept works for marching, or that same concept works for protesting, or that same concept works for objecting to certain things, or to vocalizing certain issues, or vocalizing certain things. And far too often people feel as if they don't want to do something because it's only them doing it, or it's only one person doing it. And so I just think that that's another one of the hypocrisies that should be highlighted about the some of the concepts that exist and some of the ideologies that exist within American society. And as far as the last point I'll make here is, Thoreau spoke about the power of somebody, or the power of a person being in jail, or being imprisoned, as opposed to being out in the free world. And I think that that's something that was manifested powerfully in the 60s, when things like jail-ins were taking place, and when it was power. It was power because it was power in these people, instead of being free and exercising their freedoms, allowing themselves to go to jail and to go to prison and to be incarcerated for these things. And I think that those people, as history has shown, those people exercised their freedom in a way that people who never were imprisoned or never were jailed during that time also never exercised their freedoms. And so here, I'll pass it on.
I'd like to introduce a couple ideas to go alongside our understanding of our duties. And the first is that there's a difference between what would be called positive and negative duties. A positive duty being that it's a duty to do something, to take some action. A negative duty is a duty to not take some action. I believe I have a negative duty not to harm other people. And I believe I have a positive duty to resist complying with social infrastructure that does cause harm to other people. Next, we have passive duty. We can go about our duties passively or actively. When we vote, that's something that's passive, where we're not staking anything. We're not going to go to jail for voting for the wrong person. And if we want effective justice, if we want to see justice, we have to be willing to take to follow through with our positive duties in an active way. We have to take actions to resist the institutions that would otherwise have us participating in causing harm to society.
All right, and we're a little bit past the 30-minute mark, so that gets us to the end of this episode. I want to, again, encourage people to go back and listen to previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily. This is our second episode reading Thoreau essays on civil disobedience. If you have not listened to the first episode, please go back and listen to that as well. If you're listening to this and future episodes are out, please go listen to future episodes of Rockford Reading Daily. And again, we encourage you to share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. And we put these episodes out on a daily basis to present people the opportunity to either begin or to further their journey in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. All right, we outside.